The first thing you should know is that I count things for a living. Discrepancies, variances. The half-inch gap between what a ledger says and what actually happened. I have spent 9 years training my eyes to find the number that doesn't belong. The line item that's been smoothed over. The transaction dressed up to look smaller than it is. So when my own mother stood at the entrance of the Hartwell Pavilion, scanned a seating chart with my name on it, and quietly drew a line through Table 2 and wrote Table 14 in its place, I noticed. Of course I noticed. I notice everything. That's the job. Table 14 was by the kitchen doors. I want to start there at that exact moment because everything that came after, the toast, the badge, the silence that fell over 400 people like someone had cut the power. None of it makes sense unless you understand that my mother had been editing me out of the family ledger for a very long time. The wedding was just the day she finally got caught doing it in public. My name is Renata Voss. I am 34 years old. And for 9 years, I was the only reason my family had a roof that didn't leak. The pavilion smelled like white lilies and rented elegance, the specific scent of a venue that charges by the hour and bills you extra for ambiance. My half-sister Camille was marrying into the Ashford family, old construction money, the kind that builds shopping centers and names them after dead relatives. And my mother had spent 4 months planning this wedding like it was a hostile takeover, which in a sense it was. Camille was 26, I was 34. We shared a father and almost nothing else. I arrived at 6:15, 23 minutes after the ceremony was supposed to start, because the GPS rerouted me through a closed bridge, and I'd had to call the office to push a Monday filing deadline. I was wearing a navy dress, low heels, no jewelry except a thin watch my late grandmother left me. The only inheritance anyone in my family ever admitted I deserved. I still had my building lanyard clipped inside my clutch. I hadn't thought to take it off. You don't think about a lanyard when you're worried about a bridge closure. My mother met me at the door the way she always did. Not with a hug, but with an inspection. Her eyes went from my shoes to my hair to my dress, cataloging every place I'd failed to be someone else's daughter. "You're late," she said. Not a question, a verdict. There was an accident on the Route 9 overpass. I called Camille's wedding coordinator and told her I'd be Table 14, my mother said, cutting through my sentence like she was trimming a hedge. Near the kitchen. It's quieter back there, less distracting for the cameras. I want to be honest about something. I did not argue. I have spent my entire adult life not arguing with Eleanor Voss, because arguing with her was like arguing with weather. Pointless, exhausting, and it never once changed the forecast. I simply nodded, found my coat check ticket, and let an usher in a gray vest lead me past Table 2, where my father sat beside an empty chair that had clearly been meant for someone. Past Table 5, where my mother's sisters were already 3 glasses into the open bar, and back to a corner table near a service door that swung open every 4 minutes to release a gust of kitchen heat and the clatter of dish racks. There were 2 empty chairs at my table in 4 place settings with names I didn't recognize. A second cousin of the groom's, a +1 who never showed, an elderly woman who fell asleep before the salad course, and me. I sat down. I ordered water. And I thought about my mortgage statement, which was an odd thing to think about at a wedding, except it wasn't odd at all. Not really. Because 9 years earlier, my mortgage statement and my family's entire financial survival had become the same document. Let me take you back. When I was 25, fresh out of my master's program and 3 months into my first job as a junior examiner at the regional office of the Comptroller of the Currency, my father's hardware business failed. Not a small failure, a complete one. Voss & Sons Hardware. 3 locations, 40 employees, my grandfather's name on the building, collapsed under a combination of bad inventory financing, a defaulted line of credit, and a partner who'd been quietly siphoning funds for 2 years before anyone noticed. By the time the bank called in the loans, the family home, the actual house I grew up in, the one with my baby pictures still taped inside a kitchen cabinet, was 41 days from a sheriff's auction notice. My mother called me crying, not because she loved me more in that moment, but because I was suddenly useful. I was the only Voss child with a salary that hadn't collapsed. Camille was 19, and in her second year of an expensive private college, my parents could no longer pay for. My father was 61 and unemployable in a market that didn't want a man whose only skill was running a hardware store that no longer existed. So I did what I do. I built a structure. I refinanced what could be refinanced under my own name and my own credit. I co-signed loans I had no legal obligation to co-sign. I paid the back property taxes on the house, $11,400. I remember the exact figure because I remember every figure. Directly to the county treasurer's office and cashier's checks because my mother asked me to never let it show up as a wire transfer, in case anyone asks where the money came from. I paid Camille's remaining 3 years of tuition, quietly, through a trust account I set up specifically so the payments wouldn't appear to come from me. My mother's request again. "It's better," she'd said, "if people think your father's investments recovered. It looks more dignified." Dignified? That was the word she used. As though the truth, that her elder daughter, the unglamorous one, the one with the analytical brain and the off-the-rack dresses, was quietly keeping the entire family afloat, was somehow an embarrassment to be managed rather than a debt to be acknowledged. For 9 years, I sent money home in careful, untraceable increments. I structured them the way I'd have flagged as a red flag in any audit I conducted professionally. And the irony of that was not lost on me. Not for a single year. I was, technically, the only person at that wedding qualified to identify the precise pattern of financial concealment my own family had built around me. I had become, in the most literal sense, the architect of my family's hidden ledger. And in exchange, I had been seated near the kitchen behind a service door that smelled like seared salmon, while my mother told 400 guests a story about the Voss family that did not include me in it at all. The ceremony had been beautiful, I'm told. I missed most of it from the back, craning around a floral centerpiece the size of a small dog. Camille looked radiant in a dress that, I would learn later from an offhand comment by one of the bridesmaids, had cost more than my entire car. The Ashford family sat in the front rows looking like an advertisement for inherited wealth. Tailored suits, understated jewelry, the specific kind of confidence that comes from never once worrying about a sheriff's auction notice. And throughout it all, my mother told a story. Not in words exactly. In arrangement. In seating charts. In who stood where in the family photos, which I learned afterward I'd been deliberately excluded from. My mother telling the photographer, just immediate family, while gesturing at a cluster that didn't include me, despite the fact that I was, biologically and financially, about as immediate as family gets. I sat at table 14 and ate a chicken breast that had gone cold somewhere between the kitchen and the back of the room, and I thought, this is the price of being useful instead of being loved. You get fed last and quietly and near the door. I did not yet know that the story was about to change. I did not know that somewhere in the front of that room, a man named Desmond Cole, Camille's new husband's best man, a man I had not seen in 3 years and had no idea would be standing at that microphone, was about to read 4 words off a laminated card clipped to the inside flap of my clutch. Words I'd forgotten were even visible, and that those 4 words were going to detonate quietly, precisely, and completely, in the middle of my mother's carefully arranged lie. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what I actually do for a living, because it matters, not as a flex, not as a flourish, but because it is the entire mechanism by which the rest of this story functions. I am a senior bank examiner. Specifically, I work in a federal regulatory capacity, reviewing financial institutions for compliance, solvency risk, and, this is the part that matters, fraud indicators in lending and asset reporting. I look at numbers that don't add up for a living. I have testified twice in administrative hearings regarding institutions that misrepresented their loan portfolios. I have signed off on reports that closed bank branches. I have sat across conference tables from CEOs who smiled at me with the specific tightness of men who knew I'd already found what they were hiding before I ever opened my mouth. It is a quiet job, an invisible one mostly. Nobody throws you a parade for catching a fraudulent loan classification. You write the report, you file it. The institution restructures or collapses or gets fined, and you move to the next file. I had built an entire identity around being the person in the room who sees what others have buried. And I had spent 9 years bearing my own family's truth so expertly that even I sometimes forgot for days at a time that I was the one holding it all up. But here's the part of the story my mother did not know, and the part that made everything that followed inevitable rather than accidental. 3 months before Camille's wedding, my work took me into a case file that, for the first time in my career, intersected directly with my own family. It started as a routine institutional review. I was assigned, as part of a 4-person federal team, to examine a regional lender called Ashford Capital Partners, a private lending arm connected distantly but unmistakably to the same Ashford family that Camille was about to marry into. Not Camille's fiancé directly, his uncle, a man named Garrison Ashford, who ran the lending arm as a side operation to the family's primary construction business. I did not connect the names at first. Ashford is not an uncommon name, and I am professionally scrupulous about recusing myself from any review with even a tangential personal connection. It's not just ethics, it's federal regulation, and I take it more seriously than almost anything else in my life. But 3 weeks into the review, cross-referencing a list of personal guarantors on a string of undercapitalized loans, I saw a name that made the floor of my stomach drop out. My father's name, listed as a guarantor on a $340,000 loan extended by Ashford Capital Partners 18 months earlier, a loan my father had never mentioned to me. Despite the fact that I had spent 9 years managing every dollar of his financial exposure I knew about, I immediately disclosed the conflict to my supervisor, recused myself from any decision-making authority on that specific loan thread, and was reassigned per protocol to a documentation-only role, meaning I could still see the file, still understand its contents for the purposes of institutional review, but I could not act on it personally, could not advise my family, could not use what I'd learned to intervene. Those are the rules. I follow rules. It is perhaps the only inheritance I ever willingly accepted. What I learned sitting in that documentation role with my hands legally tied was this. My father had not recovered his investments, as my mother had spent years quietly implying to anyone who asked. He had taken out a personal loan from Garrison Ashford, Camille's soon-to-be uncle-in-law, using the family home as collateral, not the home I had spent 9 years paying taxes on out of some vague, sentimental sense of duty. An actual, formal second lien on the property, filed 18 months before the wedding, that I had never been told about. And the loan had been used, according to the disbursement records I was permitted to see in my documentation capacity, almost entirely to fund Camille's wedding. The dress, the venue, the 4-month planning process, the destination bachelorette trip to Tulum that I'd been told, when I asked why I wasn't invited, was just for the bridesmaids. It would have been awkward. All of it, financed not by some restored family fortune, but by a second mortgage on a house I had personally kept out of foreclosure, taken from the future husband's own family, at an interest rate that, and this detail still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it, was structured in a way that violated at least 2 disclosure requirements under federal lending guidelines. Ashford Capital Partners had not adequately disclosed the true cost of borrowing to my father. They had buried an origination fee inside a processing services line item. They had structured the loan with a balloon payment due at 18 months. 18 months from the disbursement date, which meant the full remaining balance, north of $200,000, was due in exactly 11 weeks from the day of Camille's wedding. My family did not know this, or rather, my father might have signed the papers without fully understanding them, which was its own kind of grim, familiar pattern. He had never been a careful reader of fine print. That had always been my job, the role I'd inherited the way other children inherit china or furniture. My mother, on the other hand, knew. I learned this not through any illegal disclosure on my part, but through something almost absurdly simple. 3 weeks before the wedding, scrolling through a family group chat I rarely participated in, I saw a message from my mother to my aunt that read, "Don't mention the loan to Renata, she'll make it complicated. We'll figure out the balloon payment after the wedding. Garrison says there are options." I read that message 4 times. Then I closed the app, set my phone face down on my kitchen counter, and sat in my own apartment for what I later realized was almost 40 minutes without moving, staring at a wall, doing the thing I am professionally trained never to do. Nothing. No notes. No structure, just the slow, cold arithmetic of realizing exactly how small a role I'd been assigned in a story I had financed from its very foundation. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from discovering you were never actually hidden from the truth. You were simply never asked to be part of deciding what happened with it. I had spent 9 years assuming my silence was a gift I gave my family, a sacrifice they were at least quietly grateful for, even if they never said so aloud. The group chat message told me something colder. It told me my silence wasn't gratitude they were protecting. It was a variable they were managing. I was not the daughter who'd saved the house. I was the line item that might object to how the savings were being spent. She'll make it complicated. I sat with that phrase for a long time, not because it surprised me. I think some part of me had known for 9 years exactly how my mother saw me. Not as a daughter, as a financial instrument, a tool that performed a specific function and was otherwise meant to remain quiet, invisible, seated near the kitchen doors. The complication wasn't the debt. The complication was me, my training, my eyes, my inability to look at a number and not see the truth underneath it. I did not confront her. I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about a dramatic phone call or a kitchen table screaming match. I am not built that way, and frankly, neither is the law I operate under. I had information I was legally restricted from acting on in any advisory capacity regarding my own family's specific loan. What I could do, what I was, in fact, professionally obligated to continue doing, was complete the institutional review of Ashford Capital Partners as a lending entity. Not my father's loan specifically, the pattern, the systemic issue. Because it turned out my father's loan wasn't an isolated case. Garrison Ashford had been doing this for years, extending personal loans to financially distressed families, people desperate enough, embarrassed enough, eager enough to maintain an appearance of stability using undisclosed fees, predatory balloon structures, and collateral arrangements that, in at least 4 other cases our team identified, had already resulted in forced asset liquidation when families couldn't make the balloon payment. 4 other families had lost homes, actual homes, not metaphorical ones. My father's loan, due 11 weeks after his younger daughter's wedding, was on track to become the 5th. The wedding my mother was so determined to present as a return to Voss family dignity was, in the most literal financial sense, being funded by predatory debt secured against the home I had spent 9 years protecting, lent by the uncle of the man Camille was marrying, structured by a company that was, as of 3 weeks before the ceremony, under active federal review for the exact pattern of misconduct that had created the loan in the first place. I had the full institutional finding, not gossip, not suspicion, a federal compliance file with disclosure violation citations, disbursement records, and a balloon payment schedule with my father's signature on it, cross-referenced against 4 other victim families with nearly identical loan structures. I had read those other 4 files too in the course of my documentation work, and I remember one in particular, a widow in her 60s, a retired schoolteacher, who had taken out a loan from Ashford Capital to cover her late husband's medical debt and lost the house she'd lived in for 31 years when the balloon payment came due and the promised refinancing options never materialized. I remember thinking, reading her file at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon with my coffee going cold beside the keyboard, that her story and my father's story were not 2 different things. They were the same predatory mechanism wearing 2 different faces, and mine happened to be the face I'd grown up calling Dad. That was the moment the case stopped being abstract to me. Not when I saw my father's name on the guarantor list. That had been a shock, sharp and immediate, but shock fades. It was the widow's file that made the anger settle into something permanent and useful, the kind of anger I know how to build a structure around. Because if Garrison Ashford had done this to a stranger, knowingly, repeatedly, then whatever he had done to my father wasn't a special arrangement extended out of family generosity toward his nephew's future in-laws. It was the same machine, running the same way it always ran, and my family had simply been fed into it like anyone else. Except my family had a daughter inside the federal system who happened to see the gears turning before the machine finished its work. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do next, because precision is the only thing I trust myself with when the subject is my own family. I did not call my father. I did not call my mother. I did not draft so much as a single text message hinting at what I'd found. I completed my documentation role exactly as required, flagged the systemic pattern to my supervising examiner for the institutional level enforcement track, and went home every night to an apartment that felt for the first time in years like the only honest room in my life. And I had a badge. An actual, physical badge, the kind regulatory examiners are required to carry into any institution we're actively reviewing, displaying my name, my title, and the seal of the federal office I represent. I had clipped it into my clutch that morning out of pure habit, the same unthinking habit that makes you check twice that you've locked your front door. I had no plan to show it to anyone. I had no plan to say a single word about Garrison Ashford, or his balloon payment, or his disclosure violations at my own sister's wedding. I just wanted to eat my cold chicken at table 14 and go home. But you don't always get to choose the moment the truth decides to introduce itself. The toast began around 8:40, after the plates had been cleared, and the lighting had dimmed to that specific gold the venue clearly charged extra for. I remember checking my watch, my grandmother's watch, and thinking I could leave within the hour without it being rude. The best man stood up first, Desmond Cole. I recognized him the instant he rose, though it took me a moment to place exactly why my stomach tightened. Desmond had been my supervisor for 2 years, early in my career, before he left the regulatory side entirely to take a compliance directorship at a private banking consortium. The kind of job that pays triple what federal examiners make, doing essentially the inverse work, helping institutions stay clean enough to survive the people like me. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. I had absolutely no idea he knew the Ashford family, let alone that he was close enough to the groom to be standing at that microphone in a rented tuxedo, tapping a champagne flute with a fork. For those who don't know me, Desmond began, in the easy, practiced cadence of a man who'd given toast before, I'm Desmond. I've known Theodore, the groom, since business school, and I had the genuine pleasure of getting to know the Ashford family over the past few years through some work I do. Garrison especially, quite the operator, that man. A ripple of polite laughter. I felt something cold settle into my chest. I did not yet know what Desmond knew. I only knew that quite the operator was, in my world, a phrase examiners use about people we are actively building a case against. He continued through the usual material. Funny anecdotes about Theodore's college years. A warm line about how Camille had civilized him. The crowd laughed in the right places. My mother, 3 tables up, glowed with the specific satisfaction of a woman watching her arrangement function exactly as designed. And then Desmond did something that, I would later understand, he had absolutely no idea was about to detonate an entire family's architecture of lies. He gestured toward the back of the room, toward table 14, toward the kitchen doors, toward me. With the easy familiarity of someone spotting a colleague at a conference. Actually, I owe a debt of gratitude to someone in this room I didn't expect to see tonight, he said, and 400 heads turned, including mine, in confusion. Renata Voss, I had no idea you were Camille's sister until I saw the place cards an hour ago. Small world, right? My mother's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes did. Some of you might not know what Renata does for a living, Desmond went on. And I felt every cell in my body go very, very still. But I do because 3 months ago her office and mine were on opposite sides of a federal compliance review that, frankly, scared the hell out of half my industry. Renata's a senior examiner, federal level. She doesn't just review banks. She's the person who finds the thing the bank was hoping nobody would find. He laughed, a warm, oblivious laugh, raising his glass toward me like this was a compliment. Like this was a charming bit of trivia about the quiet woman near the kitchen and not, as it was about to become, a lit match dropped directly onto a structure soaked in gasoline. I actually still have her badge memorized from the review meetings, he said, grinning, gesturing at my clutch, which I had foolishly, instinctively raised slightly when he gestured at me, the laminated edge of my federal credential catching the gold light just enough to be visible from his angle near the front. Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Senior Examiner Renata A. Voss. I'm telling you, when this woman walks into your institution with that badge, you start praying. Laughter again, lighter this time but different. People were looking at me now, really looking for the first time all evening, not at the woman seated near the kitchen door, at the badge. My mother's hand found her wine glass. I watched her knuckles whiten around the stem. I should explain, because the audience didn't yet understand what they were witnessing, even though Desmond had just handed them the key. A senior federal bank examiner is not a job title that exists for decoration. It is a credential that carries actual legal weight, the kind of authority that, when paired with the right documentation, can be presented to financial institutions, to courts, to anyone with a legitimate need to verify a claim against a lender. I had not planned to use it that night. I had, in fact, spent the entire drive over reminding myself that this was Camille's day, that I would smile, eat my cold chicken, and leave quietly, the way I always did. But Garrison Ashford was sitting at the second table from the front. And Garrison Ashford had just heard, in explicit detail, exactly who I was, what I did, and that I had, according to Desmond's unknowing toast, recently completed a federal review of an institution bearing his name. He stood up. Too fast. His chair scraped audibly against the floor, a sound that cut through the room more sharply than any words could have. "Desmond," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Let's not turn the toast into a business meeting, It was the wrong thing to say. Not because it was rude, because it was revealing. A room full of wedding guests who had been pleasantly buzzed and only half listening suddenly sat up straighter, the way people do when they sense, before they can articulate why, that something underneath the floor has shifted. My mother stood up next. "Renata," she said, and her voice had the brittle brightness of a woman trying to stage manage a crisis in real time. "Why don't you come up and say a few words about your sister? We'd love to hear from you." It was not an invitation. It was an extraction attempt. Get me to the front. Get me talking about something soft and sentimental. Bury the moment in cake-cutting logistics before anyone asked a follow-up question. I understood the maneuver instantly, the way I understand a balance sheet that's been padded to hide a shortfall. I have spent my entire career learning to recognize when someone is trying to redirect attention away from a number that doesn't add up. I stood up anyway, just not for the reason she wanted. I walked from table 14 to the front of the room, past the kitchen doors, past my father, miss, who would not meet my eyes, past my aunts, past the Ashford family's perfectly tailored disapproval, and I did not raise my voice when I reached the microphone, because I never raise my voice. I have learned that the quietest delivery is always the one that lands hardest in a room that's expecting a scene. "I'd love to say a few words," I said, "but I think, given what Desmond just shared, it's actually relevant to something I learned 3 months ago in my professional capacity, that I think this family deserves to hear before the marriage is finalized in everyone's mind as a happy ending." My mother's face went the color of the tablecloth. "Renata," she said, low, sharp, a warning disguised as my name. 11 weeks from today," I continued, "there's a balloon payment due on a $340,000 loan secured against our family home. The loan was issued by Ashford Capital Partners. The collateral is the house I personally paid back taxes on 9 years ago to keep it out of a sheriff's auction, with my own money, structured specifically so that no one in this room would ever know it was me." A silence fell that I can only describe as total. Not awkward silence, structural silence. The kind that happens when a room's entire understanding of an evening shifts at once. "The loan," I went on, "was used to fund this wedding. All of it. The venue, the dress, the trip to Tulum the bridesmaids took without me. I know this not from speculation, but from a federal compliance file, because Ashford Capital Partners is currently under active review for failing to disclose origination fees and structuring predatory balloon terms against at least 4 other families. Families who have already lost their homes under nearly identical agreements. My father's loan, due in 11 weeks, is on track to become the 5th. Garrison Ashford was on his feet again, this time saying something about lawyers, about defamation, about how I had no right. And I let him finish, because I always let people finish digging before I show them how deep the hole already is. "I have no obligation to disclose any of this to you tonight," I said calmly, directly to him, the way I'd address a CEO across a conference table. I'm not disclosing the specific case findings. That would violate federal protocol, and I take that seriously. More seriously than anyone in this room seems to understand. What I am telling 400 witnesses in a private capacity as a guest at this wedding is a fact about my own life. That I paid $11,400 in back property taxes 9 years ago. That I have sent money to this family every month since, structured specifically at my mother's request to look like something other than what it was. And that the home those payments protected is now collateral on a loan that funded a wedding I was seated near the kitchen for. I turned to my mother. "You told Aunt Linda not to mention the loan to me," I said. "Because I'd, quote, make it complicated. I want you to understand something. I'm not the complication. I never was. I was the only thing standing between this family and the auction notice that almost took the house when I was 25. I have been standing in that exact spot for 9 years. Tonight is simply the first time anyone in this room has been forced to look directly at where I was standing." I set down the microphone. I did not wait for a response because there was nothing left that needed saying. And I have learned in 9 years of audits that the most devastating reports are the ones that simply state the facts and let the silence do the rest of the work. I walked back to table 14. I picked up my coat and I left. I did not hear from my mother for 11 days. When she finally called, it was not an apology. It was a request. Could I look at the loan documents? Could I tell her if there was any way around the balloon payment? Could I, in her words, fix this the way you always do? I want you to sit with that phrasing for a moment because I have, many times since, the way you always do. As though 9 years of quiet, structured, deliberately invisible financial rescue had simply been a personality trait, a function I performed, rather than a sacrifice she had spent that entire time actively concealing and, in the final accounting, resenting me for. I told her I would not be advising the family on the loan, not because I couldn't. My recusal had only ever applied to my formal regulatory capacity, and I was, as a private citizen, fully entitled to consult a personal attorney on my father's behalf if I chose to. I told her I would not, because I had decided somewhere on the drive home from the Hartwell Pavilion, gripping a steering wheel at 11 at night in a navy dress that suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life, that I was done being the family's undisclosed liability. If they wanted to know if there was a way around the balloon payment, they could ask the man who'd issued it. They could ask Garrison Ashford, who, I'd learned through entirely public channels, the kind anyone can read, was now facing a formal federal enforcement action that named specifically the disclosure violations on loans matching my father's exact structure. My father called once. He didn't ask me to fix anything. He said simply, "I didn't know you'd been paying that long. I should have known. I should have asked." It was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said to me in 9 years, and I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, and it still did not change the boundary I had drawn. Camille's marriage survived the wedding, technically. I don't know what survived inside it. I heard secondhand that the Tulum trip photos quietly disappeared from her social media a few weeks later. I heard that Theodore, to his credit, and I want to give credit where it's earned, was furious with his uncle, not with me. I heard that the balloon payment was eventually restructured under the federal consent order that resulted from the broader Ashford Capital Partners enforcement action, which mandated relief terms for affected borrowers, including, as it happened, my father. I want to be clear that I take no pride in any of that. I didn't speak that night to engineer a financial rescue for people who had spent 9 years pretending I didn't exist, except as a wire transfer. I spoke because I was done being edited out of a story I had quietly financed from the very beginning. The relief that followed was a function of federal regulation doing exactly what it's designed to do: protect borrowers from predatory lending, not a reward for my speech, and not a debt my family had somehow repaid by accident. My mother and I have spoken twice since the wedding. Both times, briefly, both times initiated by her. Both times about logistics rather than anything resembling repair. I do not expect a third call to be different, and I have made my peace with that, in the specific way you make peace with a number that simply isn't going to reconcile no matter how many times you run it. I sent Camille a card on her first anniversary. Not because I'd forgiven the seating chart or the 7-minute drive past table 2, or the 7 years of family photos I quietly noticed I wasn't in. I sent it because she was 19 when the house almost went to auction, and 19-year-olds don't draft loan structures or write group chat messages calling their sister a complication. She didn't write me out. She was simply never told I was ever written in. I still have the badge. I carry it the same way I always have. Clipped where it's supposed to be, doing the job it's supposed to do. Completely indifferent to whether anyone in the room understands what it means until the exact moment it matters. I have learned since that night that the most important boundary I will ever set is not a sentence I say out loud. It's the quiet, structural decision to stop being useful to people who only valued the function and never once valued the person performing it. I do not know if my family will ever fully reckon with what 9 years of silence cost. I'm no longer responsible for making sure they do. My job has always been to find the discrepancy, write the report, and let the people who built the ledger answer for what's inside it. I wrote my report. I read it out loud once, at a wedding to 400 witnesses who will probably remember it longer than they remember the cake. And then, for the first time in 9 years, I went home. To my home. The one with my name on the deed. The one no one had to be quietly protected from finding out about. And I finally slept.